Didì disse a Didò di a Didù, Didì a Didì ciò che Didì disse a Didò. Didì disse a Didò di a Didù, Didì a Didì ciò che Didì disse a Didò. So here the big exercise is the articulation of the Italian D.
Exactly, which is not the same as the American d sound.
Exactly, D. It's very clear, we can say. Dental and the tip of the tongue has to be really in front, under the, come si dice, I denti di sopra.
Right under the upper teeth.
Right into the upper teeth.
Right on, like
D.
right on the teeth, right?
Exactly,
D.
but not rigid, because the articulation is dead, but if we can do D, the strong sound comes out. Didì disse a Didò. It's really un susseguirsi di
Exactly.
This is also an exercise.
Actually, this probably wouldn't be a bad thing for people who have problems rolling their R's either, because if you can get these d light enough and fast enough, eventually maybe you can relax the front of the tongue.
Yes, yeah. So, Didì disse a Didò.
And the interesting thing for me there is also, again, that we don't have glottals. So we don't say disse a.
Yes.
We don't break the two vowels, right? We wanted them to glide into each other.
Exactly. Also, after Didò di a Didù, possiamo legare tutto. Didò di a Didù, di dire a Didì. And this di dire, not di dire, sometimes is the mistakes. Di dire a Didì.
So we're not doubling any of these D's, they're all single.
Di dire a Didì ciò che Didì disse a Didò.
So the only real double consonants we have in here are the double S's in disse, and we also have a raddoppiamento sintattico.
Between ciò che, because ciò is drucciolo with O with accent, ciò che, and we have to double the C. And the pronunciation is like a K consonant. It's like American K.
Although the Italian K doesn't have as much aspiration as ours, right? It's not ciò che.
Yeah, not ciò che, but ciò che. Yes, always softer, right?
So I like this because the E vowel is so front, and if you can get that on the very first didì disse,
yeah,
then you can find a place where all the other vowels line up with it.
Didì disse a Didò. Yeah, it's also a good exercise to keep all the vowels in the same place. We have the sensation to keep all the vowels in the same place.
Exactly, and it means
we have three persons: Didì, Didò, e Didù.
Okay.
So Didì told to Didò, disse a Didò, Didò.
So this is what she told her to say.
Exactly. Didò, di a Didù, tell Didù. Di dire, to tell a Didì,
To Didì, yeah.
to Didì. Ciò che Didì disse a Didò, what Didì told Didò. Didì disse a Didò, Didò di a Didù, di dire a Didì ciò che Didì disse a Didò. Didì disse a Didò, Didò di a Didù, di dire a Didì ciò che Didì disse a Didò.